Hello, I'm Najimo. I've been part of the Evoker community for years, and despite not really being a main theory crafter or rating at a Hall of Fame level, I'm a cutting edge raider, and I absorbed a lot of knowledge from higher players. And I feel I have a decent enough grasp on how each spec plays to make this video. This is a PowerPoint on Hover. So why do I feel I need to make an essay for a single ability in this WoW game? Simple, Evokers are a pretty underrepresented class. Not only popularity because people don't like the dragon form, but also because the playstyle of being a 25-yard caster puts a lot of people off from playing the class. Even during the eras where Augmentation was meta, it was only played at extremely high level keys while also keeping a low population on the average player bracket. This caused the class to have wave after wave of incomplete information or just outright lies on how it plays in real content. Sometimes assuming mistakes are just how it is or making up facts that don't make any sense. So, Hover is, in my opinion, the most important part of any Evoker spec toolkit, and it's the most important part of the class to master. And this is how you actually differentiate bad Evokers from good Evokers. So, what is Hover? Hover is a short cooldown ability that increases your movement speed, dashes you in the direction you're moving. You can also cast it while sitting still to just do a short spin. But most importantly, it allows the Evoker to cast while moving for a short period of time. You can talent it to get 2 charges, and it pretty much gives Evokers all of their mobility outside of damage and healing cooldowns like Dream Flight, Breath of Eons, Deep Breath, and Rescue. And it's their bread and butter to mitigate the 25-yard range and all the positioning requirements that some abilities have. Notably, this does not affect empowers, such as Fire Breath, but this ability is so insanely good it cannot be overstated. It allows you to bypass a lot of dangerous moments in fights without losing a single bit of uptime. I will now go over the specifics of each spec and how important Hover is to them individually. This is a small Venn diagram I made in regards to how each spec uses Hover. Keep in mind that whenever you press Hover, you can actually benefit from all 3 of these at the same time. You can use Hover as Devastation to position better. You can use Hover as Preservation to get more uptime and get more damage in. Context matters. This is just an oversimplification and just a matter of how often do you expect to use Hover for this specific purpose on this spec over other purposes. Starting off on Devastation. Devastation is deceptively simple, and at the same time, it's actually simple. Considered by many to be the red paladin of ranged DPS, Devastation is a cast on cooldown caster with no sort of resource management gimmick or rotational gimmick outside of the recent inclusion of Engulf and Scorching Embers, but this video is not actually about those. Devastation's empower abilities, while being very powerful on their own, have a lot of power backed into the synergies through talents like Iridescence or Power Swell, and as such, they are pushed to be cast on cooldown as soon as they are up on most scenarios, and with the talent capstone causality, every time Disintegrate deals damage, you will be casting those powers more frequently. Thankfully, Disintegration is your main spender and is often like 60% of your time spent on single target. So Devastation has its iconic low APM heavy hitter playstyle. So what's the catch? You just press a blue beam and win? Disintegration is one of the few channeled spenders in this whole game, and it's extremely important to not only cast it, but to cast it until the end of it, to not waste any potential CDR from your most important abilities. And sometimes you will be so full on essence that you might spend like 10 seconds sitting still, channeling Disintegrate, and in a modern raid encounter, there's no way to do that and stay alive until the end. Without a Lord and Savior, Hover. Without proper Hover usage, you will be pressing less Disintegrates, which means less empowers, and due to Power Swell, less Disintegrates overall. Disintegrate not only does that, but it also packs quite a punch. It's usually your highest damaging ability at the end of fights when you combine the damage from Scintillation, the talent that procs on Eternity Surge while channeling Disintegrate. So how do you properly manage this? You find the pain points of fights where you need Hover to maintain uptime, or using your instant cast abilities like Shattering Star, Engulf, your Burnout procs. Sometimes you can even cast green spells like Emerald Blossom or Verdant Embrace in order to maintain uptime. You just use it to stutter step a bit. You will also have moments where you're forced to use hover to move or dodge, but keep in mind that your output will also be at stake if you don't play your cards right. With Pyre as your main essence spender in AoE scenarios, this becomes less of a problem, which is why you'll see a lot of M+ devs either struggle with boss damage in dungeons or doing damage in raids in general. Now we get to Preservation. Considered by many to be one of the hardest healers in WoW due to the combination of Echo being an unforgiving ramp mechanic and being the only 30-yard range healer in the whole game, Press doesn't actually need Hover as much as the other specs. In fact, it's the only one to not tell into the node that increases the duration of Hover. This is because of 3 reasons. First, your spells for sustained healing or ramping such as Echo, Reversion, and Verdant Embrace are all instant cast. At the end of an encounter or dungeon, Echo is usually seen at around top 3 of your most casted spells, and Reversion is an amazing spot healing tool in dungeons and with Grace Period. It will increase the healing you do to those targets, so you will be casting it a lot too. Second, your main healing spells, Dream Breath and Spirit Bloom, are empowers, so they cannot be cast while moving in Hover. Third, 3 out of your 4 spells that can be cast while in Hover don't actually have a lot of priority. Living Flame is a filler. It helps you farm essence birds and you can just use it to DPS. Temporal normally lets you spread echoes faster, but the echoes it applies last so long there isn't really a rush in applying and consuming them. And Disintegrate is so damage oriented you only use it in dungeons while you outright never press it in raids. All of this combined make Preservation a very mobile healer regardless of hover uptime, because most of the time you'll see hover being used for geometry. You can mitigate Preservation's short range by positioning yourself in smart ways around encounters and making sure you're all hitting all available targets with Dream Breaths and Temporal Anomalies. And that can be done faster if you use hover to dart around the map looking for the best spots to cast those abilities. That said, hover has a very important use for one of Preservation's main healing cooldowns, which is Emerald Communion. Emerald Communion is a 5-second channel that heals based on your maximum health and resource mana, transferring any overhealing you get to another healer nearby target. And this is extremely strong when combined with Life Bind, which is what you normally see in dungeons and raids. Emerald Communion has a node that lets you channel it while moving, but there's another choice node that increases your maximum health for the duration of it, which turns into more HPS from this cooldown and makes it a lot stronger. Fortunately for you, you can just remember to hover close to the end of your Lifebind ramp, cast your Emerald Communion, you can still channel it while moving completely for free. You can almost always afford to do this on Preservation, since you're way less reliant on hover as the other specs. Augmentation. A spec as controversial as it is complex, still causing confusion to this day as people don't know the value of its strengths or its weaknesses, let alone how it's actually supposed to be played. Augmentation shares a lot of the mentality as Devastation when it comes to hover. You mainly use it to keep casting Eruption or to cast Living Flame, so you can generate more Essence Burst to keep casting Eruption. Using it to maintain up Ebon Might on all your buff targets. In dungeons, the biggest difference between the two is that while Devastation can just spend Pyre all day in AoE, Augmentation is forced to use Eruption in both scenarios, which means your hover management must be on par. Thankfully, Prescience has a very short cooldown, which means it gives you a lot of room for stutter stepping without needing to burn a hover. In raids, however, we open Pandora's box. Most Augmentation Evokers at this point should be aware of how most of the targeting from Ebon Might, Shifting Sands, etc. is done through proximity. And while you can guarantee 2 out of your 4 Ebon Might targets get through with Prescience, your Ebon Might and Shifting Sands will always default to picking the 2 closest DPS to you. And in high-end scenarios, it's not uncommon for good Augmentation players to sit closer to the classes they want to buff while they're about to use their cooldowns in order to get the maximum value of their buffs. And the faster way to do that is by hovering. Use the speed boost, the dash, or just cast your way to the person you want to buff and use a cast Ebon Might beside them. For better or for worse, Augmentation skill ceiling is basically infinite. And the only thing stopping you from doing more damage with it, outside of basically uptime and always being casting, is min-maxing who you want to buff and when. On the note for time skip, it does about the same thing as Emerald Communion. Granted, it's a shorter channel, it's 2 seconds instead of 5, and only increases to 3 when you play Tomorrow Today, instead of the usual 5 from Emerald Communion. But it refunds charges of hover when used, so there's no harm in doing about the same thing and hovering before you cast time skip. Aside from that, using hover poorly or neglecting it on augmentation will reduce your uptime on Ebonite, which is your most important part of your toolkit. Hover has also received some support in hero talents, and I'd like to give some clarification on certain nodes that improve its abilities. Let's address the elephant in the room. Slipstream from Scale Commander is by far one of the strongest hero talent nodes in the entire game. It's a Scale Commander talent that resets the cooldown of both charges of Hover whenever you use Deep Breath or Breath of Eons, with Deep Breath having a really short cooldown on single target and even lower in AoE. This means that Hover Manage is basically gone for every Scale Commander Evoker outside of pure single target fights. When this was meta back in Erebor Palace, you'd basically never have to sit still as Devastation to cast Disintegration at all, no matter the fight, and I'm honestly surprised it hasn't been nerfed yet. Nimble Flyer, on the other hand, is a good choice node. It's 10% avoidance, nothing while you're inside a hover, nothing to scoff at. It's a pretty strong defensive node that if it wasn't for how strong Slipstream it was basically the default recommendation for everything. But it only saw plays on very high keys as survivability option, and since Augmentation couldn't really abuse Slipstream as well as Devastation because of the longer cooldown on Eons, it was a fine loss. Even if it made a lot of lower key Augs struggle to keep Ebonite uptime because they didn't have infinite hovers. Warp from Chrono Warden has a similar purpose. Outside of the Blink, it gave you 5 seconds of CDR on hover, with the talent that reduces damage taken by 20% for 2 seconds, decaying over the duration. It's just as niche as Nimble Flyer, but since Evokers are a passively squishy class, sometimes we actually run out of defensive suppress, and having Warp as an extra defensive was good to have. Meanwhile, Trailblazer for Flame Shaper just increases the speed and range in which you hover. It's great, but ruins the muscle memory. Sometimes you dash further than your actual range. It could be worse, but it's a niche talent. Most Evoker players must have noticed by now that this PowerPoint has no mention of Azure Strike, and I'd like to go a bit more in depth as to why this button is so shit and why you should try your best to avoid using it. I'd like to start off that as time went on, like Living Flame just got a lot stronger and got stronger synergies, on top of just dealing more damage naturally. While Azure Strike hasn't really been receiving any proper support and has been neglected entirely. For instance, you still need Protracted Talons attended in the bottom row, competing against Oppressive Roar, Renewing Blaze, Zephyr, Rescue, Source of Magic, to get a single extra target on Azure Strike, and it doesn't even increase the chance it gives you Essence Burst, because compared to Living Flame procs Essence Burst on hit, because if it can hit multiple targets, you get one extra chance to generate an Essence Burst from each of them. Azure Strike is on cast, so regardless if you hit 1 or 3 targets, it's the same chance of getting an Essence Burst from it. So if we go over spec by spec, like all Evoker specs already play Leaping Flames, so every Living Flame you cast will hit an additional target based on the rank of your Fire Breath, and that alone makes it way less likely for you to cast Fire Azure Strike even on AoE. Flame Shaper Dev plays Ruby Embers. It adds a dot component to Living Flame and makes your engulf hit harder on your main target. Snap Fire is a proc that comes from Living Flame and Pyre that gives you a double damage Firestorm. And Scorching Embers just increased reg damage taken. Azure Strike does nothing for Flame Shaper Dev. Scale Commander Dev has infinite hover charges, so you will always be casting the filler that does the most damage over the one that deals the least amount of damage. That said, it's not necessarily bad to Azure Strike in AoE as Scale Commander, but you need to remember that you need to be in a situation where you don't have cooldowns, you don't have empowers, you don't have essence, and Leaping Flames is not up in AoE, the place where you cast a ton of pyres and you have pretty much infinite empowers and infinite essences. And by that point, it's just easier to Living Flame and not have to worry about this button. On Augmentation, you play Pupil of Alexstrasza whenever AoE is relevant, because it's a talent that makes it so Living Flame will always try to hit a second target when able, and it's a second chance to generate Essence Burst. So this effectively kills Azure Strike as a button entirely, and the alternative to it, that Echoing Strike requires you to use your brain for small damage gain, but you're playing Aug Evoker, you just run Pupil, cast Living Flame regardless of the target count, and you're happy. Preservation doesn't really generate sense spurts from Azure Strike. Living Flame does a lot more damage. You can run Chrono Ward, and Chrono Flame does a lot more damage. But it's just that for preservation entirely. But why do I only compare Azure Strike to Living Flame? Simple. Azure Strike to move only comes as a replacement for bad hover management. Once you get familiar enough with encounters, this button has basically no purpose outside of niche uses like slowing mobs down or trying to not waste a hover when you're moving pack to pack. That said though, as most people call it, Azure Strike is better than nothing. If you have to cast while moving and you don't have a hover available, sure, cast a few Azure Strikes here and there, but keep in mind that instead of doing that, you could have just casted hover and used Living Flame or any other button while moving, and just remember to manage your hover charges better. When you learn it's better to hover instead of using Azure Strike to stutter step, you get way better and get way more damage out of your Evoker. If you have anything to take away from this video, just remember that this is just a big oversimplification of how it actually plays in a raid or dungeon environment. My English accent is not as strong as it used to be, so some parts of the video might have sounded a bit confusing because of stuttering or etc. Comment if you have any feedback to give, if you enjoyed this type of video, or if you felt any part was just too confusing or incorrect. I'll be glad to answer, and thanks for watching.